Hello everyone, I'm Transformers Manco 328 here, and it's not about what you do differently, it's about what you do well. I've seen ugliness, insanity, disappointment, pretentiousness, frustration, blandness, unoriginality, and just flat out bad writing and bad gameplay. But nothing has hurt me to this degree. Why bother with the build-up anymore? You know what I'm about to do. All that's left is to provide a spoiler warning, so spoilers for Bioshock Infinite and Bioshock 1. No, f*** the intro, let's just get this over with. I want to focus on episode 2, so let's do a quick recap of the first episode, since I don't have as much to bitch about in part 1. You play as an alternate Booker DeWitt in Rapture, the setting of the first game in its prime. Booker gets visited by an alternate Elizabeth, who asks him to investigate the disappearance of a little girl named Sally, for which this Booker has some connection with, so he reluctantly goes along with it. It seems like it's going for a straight noir-style detective story, lacking any action-focused gameplay, and focusing more on character interaction, and letting the environment play a major role in the story. But after visiting Sandra Cohen from the first title, we travel to a more run-down part of Rapture, returning to the shooting gallery gameplay of Infinite, in addition to the environment looking very similar to the bleak, ruined setting from the first game, which had far more variety and atmosphere in its environments than this. I also ran into a glitch near the end which prevented me from progressing, so that soured my mood towards the DLC, but after shooting down the Big Daddy in one of the few times I can safely say it's a boss battle in this series, Liz reveals that you're actually an alternate Comstock, not Booker. Now here's where we get into some massive spoiler territory. You see, at the end of Infinite's main story, Liz becomes omnipotent and uses his power to show Booker that he sold his daughter to Comstock to pay off a gambling debt, but more relevantly, that the story diverges at Booker's baptism following the massacre at Wounded Knee. In some timelines, he accepts and becomes reborn as Zachary Hale Comstock, who, along with the help of the Luteces, founds the floating city of Columbia and becomes the antagonist of the main story. So to prevent Comstock's existence, Liz drowns Booker at the baptism before he can choose to be cleansed of his sins or not, which also removes Booker DeWitt after Wounded Knee from the equation, as well as, seemingly, most alternate Elizabeths. That's bullshit. The ending runs on the many worlds theory, which states that any and all outcomes exist in different universes. That means that drowning Booker will simply open up a third option, rather than remove the first two. Now he can either accept, reject, or trip like the world's unluckiest brawl player and drown before he can choose. Back on topic, this Comstock stole Anna from Booker as usual, but Booker was stronger in the struggle this time, enough to accidentally behead Anna. Jesus! Comstock felt guilty, so he asked the Luteces to bring him to Rapture so he can hide out and escape his guilt, which piled on further by his interaction with and subsequent loss of Sally. So this Comstock's actually a pretty decent guy who wants to try and right his wrongs, and it doesn't matter to Liz that she just stands there berating Comstock for shit he already feels bad about while the Big Daddy gets up and shoves its drill up his ass. End episode 1. Now to episode 2. This is gonna be a long one. We're put in control of Elizabeth in Paris, which is nice, until we see that leaving Sally to die in Rapture ate away her conscience. So she asks the Luteces to bring her to Rapture, which the Luteces warn her is not a smart idea to do so. After realizing the Comstock she let die last time wasn't really a bad guy, we see Liz wake up in front of some splicers, accompanied by Atlas from the first game. A hallucination of Booker saves her by telling her to lie to Atlas by claiming she's Suchong's lab assistant, and that she can get them back to Rapture. After Atlas lets her go do her thing, because Atlas isn't the smartest gaming villain, Liz finds that the Big Daddy killed her in its rampage after killing Comstock. Because she returned to the place she died, she is no longer able to open tears and somehow gets her right pinky back. Okay, wouldn't she be creating a time paradox just by seeing her corpse? Unless they revealed that she opens tears by D4C? Wouldn't that be awesome? But that's not my point. It's this. In the March 2010 issue of Game Informer, Andrew Rayner reviewed, ironically, Bioshock 2. To which he brought up the criticism that it does not fulfill the power fantasy of a Big Daddy until the last 3 hours of the game. 2 issues later, in the feedback section, Jason Osman responded by bringing up that, because the story explains why Subject Delta was so weak in comparison to other Big Daddies, it's perfectly excusable. The staff responded by saying that, just because a design decision is supported by the plot doesn't mean it's a good decision to begin with. Following up by bringing an example of a Superman game where he's just a normal guy would be disappointing regardless of the narrative because it wouldn't fulfill the power fantasy of being Superman, distracting from what the game is and bringing attention to what it could have been instead. That's precisely the criticism I'm leveling towards this DLC. Promising players the ability to play as Liz implied that players would be able to use her tear powers in interesting and more direct ways in the gameplay, while keeping what made Bioshock Infinite's gameplay so fun. By starting the DLC campaign with taking away her terror powers and omniscience, you take away a good part of why Liz was such a unique and interesting character, instead opting to make her a skin of Booker from a gameplay perspective, except without the component that made it engaging. Okay, her melee attacks only push enemies back, though they're knocked out if they don't notice her, but that makes for more interesting stealth gameplay. Players not good enough with stealth gameplay can use the various new crossbow bolts and other weapons from the main game to get through alright. If you want to play it more like a Metal Gear title, the game adds the fittingly labeled 1998 mode, where you are not allowed to kill a single enemy in the game, which I appreciate, in addition to the Peeping Tom plasmid, allowing her to have X-ray vision or turn invisible. So I have to admit, the gameplay's still as strong as ever. What I don't like is the fact that the story plays out like Fetch Quest the story. Think about it. It's already enough that Liz has to find a way out of Rapture, but Liz finds a lab that Suchong was working in, as well as a Lutece device. Yes, Lutece, as in their technology from Columbia is in Rapture. Suchong was working with Fink the whole time. I'll get to that in a minute. Liz finds blueprints telling her what she needs to fix it, which she does find in a sequence that brings the plot to a screeching halt, comparable to the Asylum portion of Psychonauts, only without any endearing characters to compensate. When she repairs the device, she arrives on the First Lady in Columbia, where she takes the spare Lutece particle to use to get her and Atlas out of Rapture. But Suchong brings the plot to another screeching halt by demanding that she bring him a hair sample from Fink's office before he brings her back to Rapture. After that part that only served to explain two things I'll get to in a minute, she brings the hair sample to him, but Andrew Ryan sticks his guards on her. After taking them out, which, should I mention, brings the plot to another goddamn screeching halt, she heads to Frank Fontaine's office, where she uses the Lutece particle to raise the building to Rapture. Alice takes this time to gas Liz and demands that she give him the ace in the hole. I didn't remember that Atlas remembered that Elizabeth told him that she was Suchong's lab assistant, so when I first played this DLC, I thought this came right the f*** out of nowhere. It still feels like it came out of nowhere, but she ends up going through several torture scenes that I swear just exist to make Liz a dark and tragic character when she really didn't need to be, until Booker tells her where it is. She goes there, witnessing a Big Daddy shove its drill up Suchong's ass, because it has to at least once per episode, and gets the ace in the hole, which is...
Would you kindly...
1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Alright, please forgive my sudden outburst, but seriously? You're letting a major plot point, no, the major plot point from the original game be explained by a crossover story? Was there any hint, any indication in that story that would lead anyone to say, yeah, Alice got Would You Kindly off of this woman from a completely different story? I didn't even reach concept stages by the time this one was finished. This brings me back a bit to Suchong and Fink's collaboration. There was no indication that these two worked together in either game, except Fink's songbird being too similar to the Big Daddies to be a coincidence, but that's really it. And he could just as easily have replicated the science from observing the distance, or, you know, developing the technology himself. He made the handyman, for crying out loud! You can easily forgive Suchong's audio diaries never mentioning it in the original, as they didn't have Infinite planned out before the first Bioshock was released to the masses. But Infinite was where they could lay the seeds of a larger connection. And aside from Songbird similarities to the Big Daddies of Rapture and a few thematic similarities which can be passed off as a coincidence, which they were trying to in the main game's ending, there's never any hints that they could have been in cahoots with each other. Likewise, Alice mentions nothing about having obtained the secret to Jack Ryan from someone who is otherwise uninvolved with anything. Having Atlas be shown to have forced Suchong to turn Jack into his slave left enough of an implication that he knew already.
I had you built. I sent you topside. I called you back, showed you what you was capable of. Even that life you thought you had, that was something I dreamed up.
Bioshock 1 is fine as a standalone story. It didn't need a similar yet unrelated story trying to explain questions where none were asked or needed. The explanation they give for Fitzroy going nuts works better because it's a question that needed answering, and is explained using characters and story elements of the main Infinite story instead of trying to connect it to the first game. Right afterwards, Alice smashes Liz in the chest with a wrench. So the omnipotent, multidimensional, godlike woman dies the same way most splices are dispatched in the original title. Truly a dignified way to die. Also, what's the point of having Atlas do that himself? Wasn't it already greatly established in the first game that Atlas is a gigantic douche? There's no real reason to make him even more of a bastard than we already established. It's like trying to make villains like Dr. Weil or Yuki Terumi more despicable than they already were. It's just redundant by this point. Alright, Liz can finally see beyond the various doors again and sees the events of the first Bioshock unfolding as they did in the good ending. In particular, among the little sisters that Jack saves is Sally, the one she sacrificed everything she had to save. With the knowledge that she set the chain of events that is the first Bioshock game in motion, though nothing in her vision told her it was actually her actions that caused it to begin with, she dies happy. Meh. I know that's mean for me to not care about the death of a character we all grew to know and love over the main Infinite story, but the bullshit I had to deal with really downplayed the emotional weight of her death, and instead over-centralizes Jack and Rapture, removing just about any point of the main story of Infinite for existing, especially since every presented ending cancels the preceding events entirely and brings us back to square one with minimal accomplishments, if any in this case. It's sad when there are dogs that showed up dying on screen that I care far more about when they die than when such a wonderful, long-lasting character dies. This is what bad writing can do to a character, people! And that was Bioshock Infinite Burial at Sea Episode 2, the final Bioshock story told by Ken Levine and Irrational Gains. And I didn't like it much. At all. As I said, the gameplay was actually top-notch and still fun. But I honestly didn't enjoy the storytelling, more noticeable here since it's the entire point of the game. Their attempts at bridging the first story and Infinite story just proves why crossover stories should not affect either Tales events. It's stupid, pointless, counteractive in regards to Infinite, and just plain biased towards the first game's story. It honestly sickens me that nearly every critic praises this DLC for expanding on the story in a good way, as it even ruined my experience with the first Bioshock, making me care little about the actual story and characters surrounding Rapture, and ended up having me be more invested in the atmosphere than the writing. Then again, this might have been for the better. When I was talking with my friend about this DLC, and I praised the noir-style presentation of the first half of Episode 1, hoping it would just be a character-driven story focused on the mystery rather than the action, he suggested that I check out The Wolf Among Us, a Telltale adventure game that was exactly what I was looking for. I really got invested in that game's story and was excited to see where it was going. And I wasn't into point-and-click adventure games to begin with, which is what Telltale specializes in. That shows that a good story and a good execution of a genre can let me overlook my dislike for the genre and allow me to enjoy the good stuff. That ideology was what led me to getting one of my all-time favorite games, Fire Emblem Awakening. I'm no strategy guy. I've always been more the guy who wants to be in the action rather than commanding it, but I quickly got addicted to Fire Emblem's combat mechanics. Even after beating the game 3 times, I'm still grinding my characters' levels and relationships a little every day just for the sake of it. I even made a top 10 favorite characters for that game, that's how much I love it. Hell, if Burial at Sea didn't end the way it did, I probably wouldn't have appreciated Alpha Sapphire as much as I do. I love that game for the Gen 6 mechanics, improved story over Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, the Mega Evolutions, and even giving us Deoxys without a special in-life event. But the Delta episode has this quote from Zinnia.
From generation to generation, we pass along the lore about the distortions in the world born by the Mega Evolution mechanism, and about the existence of another world, which we have long observed to be just like this one, and yet not the same. That's right, a Hoenn region that's almost exactly like this one we live in, filled with Pokemon and people like us. A world where maybe the evolution of Pokemon took a slightly different path, where Mega Evolution is unknown. A world where that war 3,000 years ago never happened. A world where the ultimate weapon was never even built.
While she's explicitly talking about the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, that quote basically stated that my adventures across the generations were not a waste of time. That, even though they may not be relevant to the specific game I'm playing, they all happen. I would not have appreciated that revelation about the Pokemon multiverse as much as I do had Burial at Sea Episode 2 not made Bioshock Infinite a waste of time. While I still enjoyed Bioshock Infinite's main story, I realized that Burial at Sea gave me more than it took away. If there's anything I gained from this experience, it's that even the worst things you can think of probably did more good for you than you'd give them credit for. So even though I still dislike Burial at Sea, I will admit that I have made peace with it at the very least. I'm Transformers Fanco 328, and you see what I mean by my story-driven games being outclassed by Pokemon? And done. I'm finally done with this shit. And I didn't make a stupid story arc out of it either. Hang on. Who are you? What was that?
Oh, just one of your stupid mortal devices that I forgot to get rid of. For you see, I am you from an alternate future, where you became one with the fell dragon Grima.
Is that so?
Yes, and now that...
Look, I make dumb YouTube videos, not 1960s Star Trek episodes. Too soon?